Some cases are harder to let go of, even for a private investigator with decades of experience. When I first heard about the disappearance of Elliot Graves, it sounded like a straightforward missing persons case. Elliot was a 28-year-old YouTuber known for chasing urban legends. His most recent trip to the Appalachian wilderness near Hawthorne, North Carolina, ended in silence. His parents had begged me to find him, to uncover the truth of what happened to their son. The local authorities had written him off as another reckless hiker who got lost in the woods. They said it wasn't uncommon people underestimate the ruggedness of Appalachia, and not all of them make it back. Still, something about the case didn't sit right with me. Elliot's YouTube channel was full of cocky, confident explorations of ghost towns, supposed haunted woods, and abandoned buildings. But his final videos were different. His usual bravado was replaced by nervous energy, his words disjointed and frantic. He spoke of glowing yellow eyes in the forest and a low growl that seemed to follow him. He mentioned something called the Cherokee death cat, or Iwa, a creature of Cherokee legend said to bring death and misfortune to anyone who encountered it. As an investigator, I was skeptical of folklore. People disappeared because of missteps, predators, or bad luck, not monsters. But Elliot's parents were desperate, and I'd made a career of following threads most others were too afraid to tug. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take the case. What I didn't know was that this thread was attached to something far darker than I'd ever imagined. When I arrived in Hawthorne, it felt like I'd stepped into another century. The small town was the kind of place where time moved slower, where people whispered instead of shouted, and where strangers were greeted with caution. I started my investigation at the local diner, the last place Elliot had been seen before venturing into the woods. The locals didn't warm to me, and the mere mention of Elliot's name seemed to cast a shadow over their faces. When I asked about the Cherokee death cat, conversations abruptly stopped. People turned away, their expressions hard and closed off. An elderly Cherokee woman, Mrs. Crow, was the only one who gave me more than a cold shoulder. "He was marked," she said softly, her weathered hands resting on the table between us. "The Iwa doesn't just kill, it curses. Once it chooses you, there's no escaping it." I pressed her for more, but she shook her head, muttering something in Cherokee under her breath before walking away. The rest of the town was no more helpful. The sheriff told me not to waste my time. "People disappear in those woods all the time," he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. 9 times out of 10, it's bad luck. Don't start chasing ghosts." But a grizzled logger named Frank gave me something to work with. "If you're dead set on finding out what happened," he said, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands, "you'd better pray you don't find it. The forest, it doesn't just take people, it changes them." His words stayed with me as I prepared to venture into the woods the next day. The Appalachian forest was a maze of towering pines, tangled undergrowth, and winding trails that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. I set off early, my backpack loaded with supplies, my flashlight secured to my hip, and a revolver tucked into my coat. Elliot's trail wasn't hard to follow at first. Locals had mentioned the path he'd taken, and I found signs of his passing discarded granola bar wrappers, scuffed footprints in the dirt, and a broken camera tripod left near a stream. But the further I went, the more oppressive the forest became. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though the trees themselves were pressing down on me, and the silence, it was deafening. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no hum of insects, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. By the time dusk began to fall, I'd lost the trail entirely. The map I carried was useless. The forest didn't seem to match the terrain it depicted. Every direction felt wrong, the trees blurring together into an endless sea of shadows. That night, I pitched my tent in a small clearing, hoping to rest and reset my bearings in the morning, but rest didn't come. I was awakened in the middle of the night by a sound I can only describe as primal, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the earth itself. I froze, every instinct screaming at me not to move. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the clearing. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of something, a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. And then they were gone. Morning couldn't come fast enough, though the pale sunlight filtering through the canopy did little to ease my nerves. The growling and the glowing eyes felt like a dream I desperately wanted to forget. But the tracks I found outside my tent told me otherwise. Massive paw prints circled the clearing, too large to belong to any known predator in this region. Whatever had watched me last night had come frighteningly close. The soil where the prints pressed was damp and fresh, making it clear that the creature had been mere feet from me as I lay vulnerable. I packed up quickly, determined to press forward and find some trace of Elliot, or at least convince myself this was nothing more than a tragic accident. As I continued, the forest changed. The air grew heavier, the shadows longer, and the silence sharper. Then I stumbled into a scene that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A clearing strewn with carcasses. Deer, raccoons, birds, even a black bear lay in varying states of decay, their bodies mangled as though torn apart by something far stronger than any predator I knew. But it wasn't the carnage itself that turned my stomach, it was the eyes. Every single corpse was missing its eyes, their sockets black and hollow. My instinct was to leave, to turn back and run, but morbid curiosity, or maybe something darker, kept me there. I crouched by the largest corpse, a buck, and examined the gouges in its hide. The cuts were too clean to be from teeth or claws alone. This wasn't just feeding, it felt deliberate. Then I noticed the trees. Deep claw marks marred their trunks, the gashes impossibly high up, as though something enormous had raked them. Some of the marks were fresh, the sap still weeping from the wounds. I reached for my camera, hoping to document the scene, but as soon as I turned it on, the screen glitched. Static flickered across the display, and the lens refused to focus. Frustration turned to unease as I realized something was wrong with my equipment, or perhaps the forest itself didn't want to be recorded. The growling returned, low and guttural, and the faintest hint of whispers began to thread through the air, though I couldn't make out the words. Panic set in as I realized the growls weren't coming from a single direction. They seemed to echo from everywhere at once. My hands shook as I fumbled with my bag, forcing myself to move. I didn't look back as I left the clearing, though I could feel the weight of unseen eyes boring into me as I fled deeper into the woods. By the time I found what remained of Elliot's camp, the sun was setting again, casting long crimson streaks of light through the trees. His tent was torn to shreds, the fabric hanging in ribbons from nearby branches. His gear lay scattered, trampled into the dirt, but there was no sign of him. I called out his name, my voice cracking against the oppressive silence, but no reply came. The unease I'd been carrying since I entered the forest turned into something heavier dread. I sifted through what was left of his belongings, hoping to find a clue, but all I uncovered was a shredded notebook with barely legible scrawls. The fragments I could make out didn't make sense. It's watching me. Can't sleep. Glowing eyes. It's in my head. Whatever Elliot had encountered out here, it had driven him to the brink. That's when I felt it. A presence, heavy and suffocating. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as a low growl reverberated through the air. I turned slowly, and there it was, the Cherokee death cat. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its sleek black body rippling like liquid shadow. It was massive, larger than any mountain lion I'd ever seen, with eyes that burned like molten gold. But it wasn't just the sight of the creature that froze me in place. It was the sensation it exuded. A suffocating aura of despair radiated from it, pressing down on me until it felt like the air had been stolen from my lungs. My legs gave out and I collapsed to my knees, unable to tear my gaze away from those eyes. The creature began to circle me, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring my fear. Its growl was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I wanted to run, to fight, to do anything but sit there paralyzed, but my body refused to respond. And then it spoke not with words, but with a voice that echoed in my mind. "You don't belong here," it said, the tone cold and ancient. "This is not your place." I tried to speak, to beg for my life, but no sound came out. The death cat lowered its head, its teeth glinting like daggers in the dim light, and for a moment I thought it was going to kill me, but instead it paused, its golden eyes narrowing as though it were deciding something. Then, with a final growl, it turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving me trembling and broken in the dirt. I don't remember much about how I got out of the forest. My legs carried me on autopilot, my mind numb from what I'd seen. When I finally stumbled into Hawthorne days later, I must have looked like a ghost. The locals didn't ask questions, they just watched from their porches, their expressions grim. Mrs. Crow was waiting for me outside the diner. "It let you live," she said simply, her tone devoid of relief. "But you're not free. You're marked now." Her words didn't make sense at first, but the longer I stayed in town, the more I realized what she meant. The growling followed me, low and distant, but always present. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, darting away whenever I turned to look. When I finally left Hawthorne, I hoped the nightmares would stay behind. But they didn't. The growling is louder now, and the shadows have grown bolder. I see the glowing yellow eyes when I close my own. And sometimes, even when I don't, the Cherokee death cat didn't just let me live, it marked me as its own. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before it comes back to finish what it started. Leaving Hawthorne did not free me, though for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe it might. For the first day or two, back in my apartment in Charlotte, the urban hum of traffic and distant chatter almost lulled me into a sense of normalcy. But even then, the weight of what I'd encountered lingered. Shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, their edges sharper and hungrier. At night I couldn't sleep. The growling would come low and guttural, vibrating through the walls like a predator just outside the door. I checked every lock, every window, but nothing was there, and yet I could feel it. It was the same suffocating presence I'd felt in the forest, a creeping dread that crawled under my skin and rooted itself in my chest. My body was no longer my own. Food tasted like ash. My limbs felt heavy, and every time I glanced at my reflection, I swore something about it had changed. The worst was the eyes. At first they only came in dreams. Glowing yellow orbs hovered in the darkness, their gaze pinning me down as whispers slithered through my mind. But soon they started appearing while I was awake. I'd catch them in the corner of my vision too, burning points of light just beyond the edge of my periphery. Whenever I turned to look, they'd vanish. But their presence left a tangible residue, a knot of ice-cold fear that lingered long after they disappeared. Desperate for answers, I revisited the shredded notebook I'd taken from Elliot's camp. Most of the pages were incomprehensible scratches of pen that looked more like frantic claw marks than words. But one fragment stuck out. Once it sees you, you can't run. It lives in you. It waits. The words sent a chill through me because I understood what they meant. The death cat wasn't just a creature that haunted the woods. It was something more, something that burrowed into your very soul. Days turned into weeks, and the line between reality and nightmare blurred. I stopped going to the office, convinced that the growling would follow me there too. My walls were covered with maps, photos, and scribbled notes as I tried to piece together what had happened in the woods. I became obsessed with the death cat, scouring every book, article, and archive I could find for information about it. The Cherokee called it Iwa, which roughly translates to the spirit of death. Some stories painted it as a guardian, a force that protected sacred lands from outsiders. Others described it as a curse, a punishment for those who disrespected the natural world. But one thing was consistent. Once the death cat marked you, it never let go. The growling grew louder. My neighbors began complaining, banging on the walls and asking if I had a dog. I didn't have the heart to tell them what was really happening. That the sound wasn't coming from inside my apartment, but from inside my head. The whispers followed, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing night. They weren't in English, but I understood them nonetheless. They spoke of inevitability, of the futility of resistance, of the dark thing that had claimed me. The shadows in my apartment grew bolder, shifting in ways that defied logic. I stopped turning on the lights because it didn't matter. The darkness was alive now, and it didn't need permission to creep closer. One night I woke to find claw marks on my bedroom walls, long, jagged gashes etched deep into the plaster, as though something enormous had raked its claws across the surface. I touched the marks, half expecting them to vanish like a bad dream, but they were real solid and cold beneath my fingers. That was when I realized the death cat wasn't just haunting me from afar. It was here, in my home, in my mind, in my very bones. By the end of the second month, I knew I couldn't run anymore. The death cat was everywhere, its growl in my ears, its eyes in the shadows, its whispers clawing at the edges of my sanity. The darkness had consumed me, and I could feel it pressing closer every day. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything except the inevitable confrontation I knew was coming. I had to face it. The death cat wasn't just a curse, it was a predator, and I was its prey. The only question was how long it would toy with me before finishing the hunt. Desperation drove me back to Hawthorne. I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish. Maybe I thought returning to the place where it all began would give me answers. Or maybe I just wanted to end things where they started. Mrs. Crow was waiting for me, as though she'd known I'd come back. "You can't fight it," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The Iwa isn't just a beast, it's a spirit. It doesn't bleed and it doesn't die." But I had to try. Armed with the same revolver that had done nothing in the forest and a talisman, Mrs. Crow reluctantly gave me a bundle of herbs and feathers tied with twine. I ventured back into the woods. The forest was different this time. The shadows were deeper, the silence heavier, and the presence of the death cat was undeniable. I didn't have to search for it. It found me. The glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, and the growling filled the air, louder and more menacing than ever before. This time I didn't run. I stood my ground, revolver in hand, though I knew it wouldn't matter. The death cat stalked closer, its sleek body rippling like liquid shadow, its teeth glinting in the dim light. "What are you waiting for?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Just end it." But it didn't. It stopped just short of me, its eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my knees buckle. And then it spoke again, not with words, but with that same cold voice in my mind. "You are already mine."